This video was about the subscripts used in the equations for ANOVA analyses. So in analysis of variance, we begin with looking at the sum of squares. And so this SS is the sum of squares. And this is really doing the initial calculation of the variances and the shifts in variance. For the whole group, so your total is going to be your whole group. Your sum of squares for between is between groups. And then your sum of squares within is the variance or the sum of squares calculation within each one of the groups that are being compared. Then we need to calculate our degrees of freedom. So we need to remember that our degrees of freedom are really all the little bits of information that we have and can use to run an analysis. Now it's very important to make sure that we are calculating our degrees of freedom, not only to understand computationally what's happening on the back end of ANOVA, but also ensuring that our degrees of freedom are not getting low enough where they are going past 1, so becoming negative or 0, and taking us into territory where we have very high potential of getting a type 1 error, where a type 1 error is a false positive statistical result. So again, for degrees of freedom, we need to see the degrees of freedom for the total group, the degrees of freedom between the groups that are being compared, and the degrees of freedom within each one of the groups. And so for our total group, our degrees of freedom are the total sample size minus 1. Our degrees of freedom for between the groups uses the number of groups minus 1. And for within, we are looking at really both the groups and the total sample size and making the assumption that each of our groups have equal or near equal numbers of participants. And so for within groups, we take our sample size minus the number of groups that we have. So then once we have our sum of squares and our degrees of freedom for the total for between and within, now we can get our mean square. And so this is mean square values. And our mean square values are our sum of squared divided by our degrees of freedom. And we would for this also get a total value, a between value, and a within value, but we're only using certain ones to get our final calculation or to use in our final calculation of our F statistic. So for the sum of squares, you're really using and then this is to really emphasize what's going into these mean square calculations. So your sum of square total is using each individual score in comparison to your grand mean. And then they are being squared, so they have the square value here. And for the degrees of freedom, you're looking at your total group and subtracting 1 to get your degrees of freedom for the total. Then these two together, so the sum of squares divided by the degrees of freedom, would give you your mean square for your total group. Then for between, we are now looking at each of the group means, because for between, we're really looking at the differences of variance between the different groups. So you're comparing each group mean to the grand mean of the whole group, and we have our square value here for our sum of squares. And then for our degrees of freedom for between, we are looking at the number of groups minus 1. And so then we can do our sum of squared divided by our degrees of freedom to be able to get our sum of squares between, or our mean squares between value. And lastly, we have our within values. And so for within, because this is within each one of the groups, we are looking at each individual score compared to the group mean that that individual is in. We have our square value, so we're doing a sum of the squares. And then for degrees of freedom now, we are looking at what is the sample size for the entire sample in relation to the number of groups that you have. So you can take the total sample size for the entire group and subtract the number of groups that are included in the analyses. So the subscripts of our basic formulas are that total, between, and within. Where are you looking at the whole group, or are you looking at the between the different groups or within a particular group? But we also have these other subscripts that you would use regularly, especially when you're reporting your results of your ANOVA. And so the first subscript that you would use is an I for the individual. And so if each of your individuals has a number or a value that you would give to them to designate who they are, so it's like an ID, that would be their I value, where this could be the ID or it could just be whatever it is in the sample, like the order in the sample. But each individual would have one of these values, and that would go in this I position. And then when we're looking at the factors, so anytime you see factor, this is your independent variable, which is the same as your group. And so we can have where we have one independent variable, so we have one set of groups, and so the next subscript would be for what number group they are in. And this is designated by a J, and this is the group number. And then lastly, if you have multiple factors, so if you have multiple independent variables or grouping variables that are establishing your groups, then you would go on and have what group their number they're in for this as well. And so this next one is also an independent variable too, and so this is a grouping variable as well, and this would be K, and this would be the group number for the next level. And so to give you an example, if we have, here's our outcome variable, and this would be for our individual number 2. So whether that's the order of our sample distribution or it's their ID, 2 is the designation for this individual. And this individual is in group 3 for the first factor, and they are in group 1 for the second factor. And so then you would get this outcome value for each one of the individuals in each one of your groups. And so then when you're discussing your results and you're discussing what's happening within your results and your interpretations, this is where those subscripts can be used. They also are used if you are writing out any equations in looking at how your sum of squares or your mean squares or your degrees of freedom were calculated, where you could use these subscripts to designate who is included in each one of those calculations or to give an example of those calculations that are being done.